start the show. So Jane is here, if everyone can give us your attention. Jane's going to introduce our speaker, and we're going to begin.
Hi everyone, the first thing I want to do, is this going? Is it working? First thing I want to do is tell you about next month very quickly. We have Karen Wendell coming to talk to us about travel, and she's local. She's done a lot of trips. She's done a couple of trips for the Mashpee Chamber of Commerce that I've actually gone on, and she's just a wonderful girl. So she'll be here next month to talk to you. But today, we have a great program for you with Dr. Margaret Frieswyk. She's a woman of many talents and gifts. As a lifelong learner and an educator, Margaret, better known as Midge, has been a teacher, a superintendent of schools, and a recipient of many honors and awards. After her retirement, Midge accepted the position of superintendent of Gosnell Public Schools, known as the Elizabeth Islands, or more specifically, Cuttyhunk. Today, Dr. Frieswyk will speak to us about the challenges and, more importantly, about the opportunities that COVID has given to the families and children of Massachusetts. Can I present Midge Frieswyk to you?
So probably, is she good? I just want to be sure that I haven't used a mouse in so long.
There you go, perfect.
Okay.
Do you want a chair, Midge?
No, I'm going to stand, but I just want to make sure. Okay. Okay, I can do this. So, hello everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I think Joanne, Jane, and Meg might be responsible for programs and inviting me here today. It's a topic that has been my lifelong work, not COVID, but dealing with challenges and opportunities in education. This was a big one. COVID was an incredible challenge, but at the end of my slides, my last couple of slides, are about some of the things that we learned, because that's obviously always what we want to do. As challenging as the situation is, we want to focus on, what have we learned? What can we change? What can we do better? So, as Jane said, I'm Midge Frieswyk. I've been a superintendent for quite some time. Love the work of education. I was a teacher. I was a curriculum director. I was a special education educator and a special education administrator. That probably was my favorite job because it was about people and families. And as a superintendent, you don't have that same connection. But I moved from special ed administrator into the superintendency, and I've been there for the last, 20 some odd years. I'm now on the Elizabeth Islands. If you haven't been to Cuttyhunk, you must come. We have a one-room schoolhouse out on Cuttyhunk. It is the only island of the Elizabeth Islands that's public. All of the other islands are private, but there is a child on one of the other islands, on Luncheon, who takes the boat into Falmouth and goes to Falmouth Public Schools. And we pay the tuition for her to be ferried by her father from Luncheon to the bus every morning. And then our one-room schoolhouse, and I'll talk about that a little bit as we get into the slides, has been quite robust this year. We were 1 year without any students. We are launching a STEAM Academy out on Cuttyhunk, and so the years that we don't have children, we have off-island children that come and have a field trip, week-long oceanographic experience. And then August of 2020 hit, and we went from 0 students to 8. overnight. And I'll talk a little bit about that, and that was directly COVID-related. 8 sounds like a little bit, but when you're in every grade level, and I had to get a teacher in there within a couple of days, it was a little bit of an interesting challenge. So I have about 45 minutes, and the purpose of today is to go through a little bit of the history with you. And then, because I think it's interesting, from where did this come? You know, it came across the country. And then it hit us in Massachusetts, as it did every state, by about March. Impacted the previous school year and the one before that. In about January, we began to wonder and worry. This is a domestic review of a year at a glance, but I also work internationally in schools. I work for 3 companies, and I'm an inspector and a transformation leader all over the world. And I've been doing Zoom for the last year. So I'm not in schools this past year, but I am continuing to do the transformation work. My last one was just a few weeks ago, and I was in Dubai, which is an interesting challenge when it's a little bit of a time difference. So I will tell you that those international schools are also faced with very similar challenges, and in some cases even greater challenges because of their numbers and the lack of medical care, the lack of vaccination in some areas because of poverty, and obviously poverty was a big challenge here, and the racial divide. So the presentation will be a glance at what transpired over the last several months, and then what's going to happen when September hits in just a few weeks, and what have we learned. And then if you want more information, there are some good resources. This information, some of it comes from Education Week, so I want to give credit there, as well as the Department of Education, DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education website. So it's information that is widely available. So this all started with a single closure of a high school in Washington State, and that was a really prolific pocket in the country back in February of 27th. So the first case emerged in January 29th of 2020, and you probably aren't even aware of that, although that's when we were beginning to hear some really important closure information. And then approximately 1 month later, nearly every school building in the United States was shut down. Here in Massachusetts, it was about in March. Mid-February, there were some temporary closures. Schools were beginning to close for a few days. They were allowing for some cleaning of their buildings. You might remember that some of your grandchildren, some of your children and grandchildren might have gone to school for a couple of days, and then Wednesday seemed to be the day that there would be a closure, and then they'd come back on Thursday and Friday, and that was because of the cleaning of the buildings. And at that point, the closings really were concentrated in Washington State and in New York. And what we were trying to avoid was the closure, because obviously, as your president said this morning, we were concerned about a lot of things, but we were concerned about isolation of children. You started your activity this morning, and it was about greeting each other. And you know, we're people, and teenagers that's like part of their being is to be with friends. And so we were trying to avoid that. We all avoid the isolation. We also knew that the family systems weren't always necessarily prepared to have children at home working parents, poverty, special education. Sometimes some of these children, the only meal they got was in school. So we were hoping that if we cleaned the buildings and we kept the children out a little bit, we would be able to continue school as we know it. And a question for the audience, for all of you, how many of you are educators? So pretty sizable number. So some of this is gonna resonate in regards to the emotional decisions that had to be made. This is a business about people, teachers, educators, and it's a business about children. And so it's not like other businesses whereby we're concerned about the bottom line and about profits and about investments. It's about children. And we had a really wonderful conversation at the table where I was sitting about some of the tragedies in schools and how we're still responding to Columbine and to Sandy Hook and those horrific settings. So, our job is to protect children. And in order to protect children, we need to also advocate and protect the staff. The CDC, in about the end of February, began to warn schools that they needed to prepare for closure. They called it teleschool. And this is when the conversations about how are we going to provide school virtually. It's not something that we should be proud of, but we still struggle as schools with using technology to its fullest degree. It's a marvelous resource. But when schools knew that they needed to close, there was a lot of training, there was a lot of equipment that had to be bought, there was a lot of training not only for staff, but surprisingly for students. Now, students use technology all the time, but they don't always use it in an educational way. So this was a different way of thinking about using technology. So teleschools, February 25th. Then on the 27th, the shutdown began, and Washington State was the first school to shut down. They shut down for 2 days for disinfection, and this was also based on a staff illness. So we're talking about the other side of the country, and at this point, our hope was that that's where it was going to stay, and that Massachusetts wasn't necessarily going to be part of this closure story. So this is talking a little bit about what I've already said. The CDC knew that there was a critical need to protect children physically, but they also knew if they had evidence that schools needed to be disrupted, that there was a huge emotional piece that would also be something to worry about, as well as the care and the safety. Unfortunately, we're talking about children that aren't safe in their own homes. And now we're saying to families, this child is going to be home with you 24/7. And you're going to have some responsibility to educate them. So coming from a place of many of, I would hope, your grandchildren, whereby parents are involved in education and parents are willing to adjust schedules, there's a whole population of children whose schedules of their parents can't be adjusted because they have a one-parent household, they have families that are not healthy, they have parents who are not emotionally, socially, and medically healthy. So that's what the CDC was talking about. We have to figure out this balance whereby we keep children safe from COVID, but yet we recognize some of the other issues associated with children being at home. The pandemic was declared in March, on March 11th, and that's when the World Health Organization really accelerated the closure of schools. The first state closes schools, and that was in Ohio, and 15 other states followed. Massachusetts was not one of them at this point, and that was March 12th. Massachusetts was still trying to figure out how can we involve families and children in the schoolhouse, how can we separate children. You know about distance learning, you know about those big plastic shields, you know about masking. So Massachusetts was still hoping that we would be able to keep children in school. Now if you have children in a school district, these decisions were made at a local level. So you might have experienced something different with your grandchildren than what I just said about March 11th. Because some schools were much more aggressive, were much more conservative. But as superintendents, we were meeting on Zoom almost every day. Because we know when we made a snow call many years ago, we were compared to what was happening next door. So if I made a snow call, you know, often parents would call my office and say, but you know, the community next door didn't close school and I've got to go to work and you have school closed. So we knew that the same scenario was going to be true with the pandemic. That if we closed or if we had hybrid or if we had remote, that there was going to be a comparison. So we were meeting on Zoom daily with the Commissioner of Education, Jeff Riley. And he's been our leader here in Massachusetts. He is the Commissioner of Education. He was quite challenged with making decisions because, like any state, every community is so unique. So when you think about Lawrence and you think about Falmouth or Situate or New Bedford, the scenario doesn't always translate from one community to another. So he was dealing with a wide range and a wide variety of different kind of school districts. So Idaho was the last to close on March 25th. So obviously Massachusetts was there in the mix. By May 6th, nearly all states closed for the remainder of the school year. Maryland became the last state to announce this closure, and then none of its schools would reopen for 1920 school year. And only 2 states didn't close for the remainder of the year. The decisions to close are local, and so this was not about a federal government mandate, so it was local decisions, not only at the state level, but the state made decisions, and then individual school districts also made decisions. So lots of layers of decision making. And May 7th was about the time when remote learning became commonplace. You know, when I think about this, it seems to be sort of something that we've known and loved for a long time because, but back at that period of time, that wasn't happening, even though there were many classrooms that used technology, but it was generally in the classroom in limited ways because the issue obviously is access to technology for all children. And we're a state, as all states should be, that this is about all children. This isn't just about those that can afford a computer at home. By early May, 80% of the teachers were interacting with the majority of their students daily or weekly remotely. So here we are in the fall of 2020, back to school, but not really. Let me just catch up to myself. The important department that became sort of the phone number that was on speed dial was the Department of Public Health, because they were the resource for superintendents about opening, about closure, about the house. And so when we began to think about the fall of 2020, this is where my story about Cuddy Hunk sort of kicks in. So it was mid-August, we had no students. You still have to maintain a schoolhouse if you don't have students, because a student couldn't move in tomorrow, and you have to have a schoolhouse, every community. And the Elizabeth Islands is the town of Gosnold, and there are many islands, but 4 primarily that you might know: Noshaw, Noshawina, Pensk, Penakees, and Cuddy Hunk. Penakees is the island that has had a school for adolescent boys, problematic and difficult, emotionally challenged boys. It was originally a leper colony that was on Penakees. And most recently, it opened as a school, not as a school, it's a community for adults with alcohol and drug rehabilitation. It is the building there now on Penakees, which is right next to Cuddy Hunk, is closed and is not managing any programs at all. So here I am, I live in Falmouth. I work for the Gosnold Public Schools, very part-time, because I retired as a full-time superintendent in 2016. And I took this job within months because I missed the work. I knew that I didn't want to work full-time because I was traveling internationally and working in international schools, but I knew I wanted to work in schools as an educator in some way. So I took the job and I work for them. I go over there maybe once or twice a month. I have a full-time teacher, principal, custodian on one, and she's on the ground person. She's my operations person. And I hired her when I was hired back in August of 2016. I hired her because the school committee told me that they had let the last teacher go. And I said, at that time we had 3 students in the schoolhouse, and I said, how can you let a teacher go in August? Number one, it's not your job to let teachers go, it's the superintendent's job, or the principal's job. But because it's a teacher, principal, custodian, it's a superintendent's job. So I said, how am I supposed to find someone? Well, I found the most marvelous teacher. She was leaving New Hampshire, she wanted to relocate, she's been with me ever since. So she was launching the STEAM Academy to bring off-island children to Cuddy Hunk. She was on the island at the time of August of 2020. We had no children anticipated in the schoolhouse, so she did not have a teacher contract. She did not have a principal contract. She had a custodian contract because I needed someone to take care of the schoolhouse. And so I said to her, Michelle, I need you to move back into the schoolhouse because we have 4 children who have declared residency at Cuddy Hunk. They were summer residents, and they knew what was happening in their communities, and they knew that they were going to be remote, hybrid, or something else, and they didn't want their children to do that, so they enrolled in Cuddy Hunk. If we stayed under 10 children, we were able to be face-to-face, and we were the only school in the Commonwealth in Massachusetts that had a face-to-face program September to June. And we ultimately ended up with 8 children. In May, we were at 21 of this year, we were asked from a family of 3 if they could come. I think they just sort of wanted to start their summer early, because these are all Cutty Hunk summer people. And luckily, they decided not to. That would have bumped us over the 10. So we held our breath a little bit. But we were face to face all year. We had a 2nd grader, a 3rd grader, 2 4th graders, a 5th grader, 2 6th graders, and 3 7th graders. There was a teacher, there was a full-time aide, there was a mental health professional, and that was required by ESSER money that I'm going to talk about later, which is funding for schools because of the hardship of COVID. And we had a music teacher, an art teacher, and a PE teacher. So we had a very, very robust program.
Did they come in, Midge, on a daily basis?
They lived in Cutty Hunk for the school year. So they were summer children who had homes or rented places, and because they were so clear that they didn't want to go into a hybrid remote model, they continued either in their rental capacity or in their family home that shuts down. Now, some of them, their family home was not heated, so they had to figure out residency for January and February. And so we had so we started with 5, and by December, we had 3 more from Nebraska. So, and they were also summer residents, and they opted to come back to Cutty Hunk and finish up the school year on Cutty Hunk. So it was a marvelous school year. I loved going there. It was school as school should be. It's project-based. I said to one little guy, a 2-year-old, I said, "Where are your shoes?" And he said, "Well, I'd like to go barefoot." I said, "Okay." So, you've got 8 little kids in a 1-room schoolhouse and a marvelous teacher and a barefoot kid and project-based. And it was really the way schools should be operating. One room schoolhouse for sure. So when I bump back here to fall 2020, we know that this was a combination of a lot of things in Massachusetts, but there were 4 states who required in-person instruction. In Massachusetts, we had a combination, and in some cases, we had choices for parents. If they wanted to go remote, if they wanted to go remote and in person, and most schools did not start with in-person. As I said, Cutty Hunk was an in-person 100% school. So the majority by October are hybrid, with some mixture of in-person and remote. I want to mention here, one of our bigger challenges was poverty, the racial divide, special education. So when you have children with special education needs who have an IEP that require a certain number of hours of instruction, how do you do that when you're remote or you're hybrid? And that was a real challenge to try to figure that out. And then all those kids who didn't have technology, and all those children who didn't have families that were doing instruction at home, and things as basic as this is the only meal they get when they're in school. It's breakfast and or lunch. And so how do you provide that? So schools did continue to provide meals to children throughout most of this pandemic year. So the political arena became quite evident. Health experts were telling us that we needed to be bolder. There was a lot of push about reopening schools, about bringing children back, a lot of numbers that said that children really weren't getting infected and weren't infecting others. But Massachusetts continued for a good part of the 2021 school year being remote, hybrid, or combination. And that was our commissioner, Jeff Riley, who kept sticking to figure out what are the numbers, how are these kids doing, and that's why we did administer the MCAS, and it really was diagnostic in nature. It was to tell us the learning loss. It was not to publicly flog schools and measure one school against another. The MCAS this year was a diagnostic to talk to us about the learning loss. So Biden, as you know, when he was elected, he promised that he would open schools in the first 100 days of his presidency. The infections were on the rise in November, so we had another cycle. Schools pulled back in New York City, forced to shift to a remote environment as the infection rates rise. I'm wondering for September, and I'll show you as I get into school year 21, 22, we expect to be open. But with the new variant, I would not be surprised if there was some adjustment to that. Maybe not in Massachusetts if our numbers continue to be measured and satisfactorily, but there could be some states whereby there will not be a full reopening. And in December, the vaccine became a beacon of hope. We thought if we could vaccinate people, if we could vaccinate teachers, if we could vaccinate children, that we were on our way to back to normal. And I'm going to be talking about what does that really mean. So I want to just mention here, and I know a lot of you are teachers and probably part of the teachers union, but the teachers union played a big role in making decisions about the reopening of schools, about remote, about hybrid, about a combination of things. And every time any indication in change in working conditions, and those of you who were teachers know that language, if it was a change in working conditions, it had to be bargained at the bargaining table. And so when you go from a face-to-face classroom to a hybrid classroom, as a superintendent, I had to sit at the table with the union and bargain the change in working conditions. That is a very, sometimes, not in all communities, but sometimes a very time-consuming process. So families and children were waiting for us as superintendents to say, this is the next chapter. And we couldn't always tell them what the next chapter was because we were at a bargaining table that perhaps in some communities was problematic. I'm a big union supporter. I think teachers need a good union because sometimes teachers have not been protected. But in this case, it was a laborious process to move this project along in the best interest of children. And I get goosebumps every time I say, after all these years, in the best interest of children, because that is the work. And sometimes when you get other factors involved in making those decisions about the best interest of children, it doesn't always translate to the best interest of children. That's disheartening to me.
Margaret?
Yes.
Could I just give a concrete example
Sure.
of that? So a group of teachers at the school that I worked at were asked to do a full day of in-person teaching. And then during their prep time or during their lunchtime or after school were asked to do remote teaching. And they weren't being compensated for that. So I think that was when the union started getting involved and look at, if you're asking teachers to go above and beyond, then they need that compensation.
Absolutely. And there wasn't, at that time, when we were entrenched in those conversations, extra money for towns to do that. The school budget, I'm sure you all know, is based on taxes. What does the town pay for taxes? And therefore, what kind of money does the town have? And therefore, what can we pay our employees, teachers being a body of employees? So when teachers ask for more compensation, and I can't imagine that there's a superintendent in the world that wouldn't say, you know, yeah, of course, if you're asking them to work all day and then you're asking them to work during prep time or after school, they should be compensated, but there wasn't money to do that. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about the COVID money that came down the pike, but it was a little bit after the fact. So, hybrid options continued. Some schools were fully returned to a face-to-face environment. So that's the spring of '21. That's the school year that just ended. So when we think about just in a few weeks, and in some cases even shorter than that, we're going to be reopening. And this is the memo that came out from the Department of Education, DESE, Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, DESE. This is Jeff Riley. All districts and schools will be required to return in person, full-time, 5 days a week this fall, and all previously released DESE health and safety requirements will be lifted. That was on July 30th. I can guarantee you some of that's going to change. Maybe not the full-time 5 days a week, but there will be some parameters of safety that I suspect will be reintroduced. He continues to say that there will be recommended masking in K-12 schools, and we know that some of that has already changed. This fall, the DESE and the Department of Public Health recommends that all students in K through 6 wear masks when indoors, except students who cannot do so because of medical conditions or behavioral needs. And sometimes those are children with special education needs. Masks are not necessarily worn outdoors and may be removed while eating indoors. They recommend unvaccinated staff in all grades, unvaccinated students in grades 7 and above, and unvaccinated visitors wear masks indoors. This is one of the more current issues with the union about the requirement of vaccination. And one of the largest unions in the country has just Thursday, I think it was, indicated that they are in support of mandating vaccination for all teachers. That is a very, very big move on the large unions. So as we continue through this is school year 21-22 continued. This talks about the importance of in-person learning. Not everyone is fully vaccinated. There should be physical distancing. You know, we went from 6 feet to 3 feet. We were really cramped in our little one-room schoolhouse with 8 kids and 6 feet. But we made it work. With the extent possible within their structures, but should not exclude students from in-person learning to keep a minimum distance requirement. So he gives a little bit of wiggle room there. Massachusetts has among the highest vaccination rates in any state in the nation, and evidence continues to reinforce that COVID-19 vaccines are highly effective. And then to maintain ventilation upgrades from this past year as feasible, hand washing, and policies for students to stay home when sick. We spent an exorbitant amount of money on paper towels and hand washing supplies, and that needs to continue. So this is the money that I talked about. It's called ESSER money. It comes from the CARES Act, which was passed by Congress. That's the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, CARES. And this is ESSER money, Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief money. Every school district in the state received ESSER money. There was an application that had to be filed, but it was not a competitive application, it was an entitlement. I wrote that grant back in March of 2021, because that's when the grant became available. And it had to be spent, it has to be spent by FY 2022, so it's still an active grant. Small school district like ours with no children in some cases, but this year we had 8. We got $90,000. That's a lot of money. So you can imagine what Springfield, Lawrence, Lowell, millions. So in the bottom, ESSER 1 was $13 billion to schools. Need to be spent by 2022. And then the next wave of money is $54 billion. And Cuddy Hunk will get $170,000 if I write the ESSER grant. And the only parameters for the grant is to cover expenses that are COVID related. So because we had no students in August of 2020, any expense that we had in September of 20 was COVID related. Our teacher, our aid, our supplies, our equipment, so we easily spent $80,000 because of all those expenses. One of the requirements of the grant was that a school spend at least $10,000 on a mental health professional. And this was the wisdom of Jeff Riley, because the Commissioner of Education, because he said children are suffering emotionally and socially. So every school district either expanded upon a health professional that they had, or they added some more staff. And it was specific to dealing with staff and students with COVID-related emotional, social issues. And I think I give him a lot of credit for being so thoughtful about the emotional wellness, because children did suffer. They are social beings that want to be with children, other children, with adults, and this school year, obviously, that was greatly impacted. So what have we learned? I started off by saying this was very difficult, in some cases horrific, for families, for children, for staff, obviously. But what did we learn? And virtual learning is marvelous. Technology is a resource, underutilized. And so my hope is that we have some new skills around using technology for the purpose of teaching and learning. Zoom, I mean, you know, what a marvelous tool. I don't have to any longer get on a ferry or a water taxi and go to Cuddy Hunk when I want to hold a meeting. And I will continue to do that. And it also allows more access for the community. In my community, and in many communities, parents aren't in the home. I'm cutting home, they're in Nebraska or they're in Maine, and they can still tune in to school committee meetings, they can tune into other kinds of meetings, and they were not able to do so because the meetings were held on Cutty Hunk at a particular time of day. So now, may we ever have snow days again? Probably not. Why would we? The children are not happy about this. And so that is not a decision that's been made, so don't spread the word, no more snow days, because who knows? But I will tell you, that's probably one of the worst jobs of a superintendent. You just can't win. There are articles written about that decision to call a snow day in some of the most advanced journals, you know, about the lose-lose decisions. Zoom is an invaluable tool. And then the inequities with children became a very profound reality. We always knew that, but this just hit us in the face. You know, education and access to schooling is different for a child who's, and I'm not going to name communities because there's poverty everywhere, but a child who grows up in community A and a child who grows up in community B, it is profoundly different. And some of these children can't learn because they're hungry or they're in situations that they are unsafe. So those inequities just became even clearer. The answer, what do we do about it, you know, is still to be discussed and resolved. So people say often, let's get back to normal. I don't think we want to go there, folks. I really think should not be our goal. Normal was not good enough for kids. And so what did we learn from this that we then can take away and make it better for children and for staff? And then we learned about the importance of socialization as a necessary component of educating our children. Play is critical, and I'm not just talking about recess. I was in a graduate class at Olin College. If you know where Olin College is here in Massachusetts, it is about 300 students. I'm not sure if this has expanded a little bit. And
It's in Wellesley, right?
it's, Needham. Yeah. And it was, when I was there a few years ago, about 300 of the best and brightest engineering students in the world. And I brought a group of teachers there because we still are struggling with project-based learning. We still can't kind of figure that out. You know, we still have desks and chairs and teachers at the front of a classroom with a microphone like I'm doing. And so I went to Olin College, and the graduate students were playing. And this is what it looked like. The teacher was not evident. There was a lot of conversation in the classroom. They were talking about the role of rope. So rope, R-O-P-E. And they were talking about how did we use rope in the past. So they were looking at history, they were looking at math, they were looking at literature, and looking at the future, and then figuring out how do we need rope for the future, and do we need rope for the future? What will it look like? What are the components of it from an engineering perspective? And they were discussing and playing with, amongst themselves, with the sophisticated ideas of engineering rope for the future. So, play, important component, playing with ideas. discussing, having conversations. And then mental health identification, and we talked a little bit about this at our table this morning. You all know, or this afternoon at lunch, you all know that we just don't have adequate funding for mental health. And that requires some real legislative aggressiveness about full funding for mental health. I mean, there's a lot of children that are unserved. So, that's what I have. I was told 45 minutes. It's 1:45. Any questions? I'd be happy to answer. It was a lot of information, but I think it gives you sort of an overview of from where we came to where we are today. And there's no absolute answers for September quite yet. We're still trying to figure it out. Okay, yes?
I have a question. You mentioned MCAS being used as a just kind of leveling things out at the start of the year. How do you start the year? I mean, do you go back a semester? I mean, how do you figure that all out with all the different schools, all the different levels they were at? Where do you begin?
So, a good answer to most questions today is it depends. And, you know, if you're in Lowell and Lawrence, and I keep using those as examples, or you're in Falmouth, and then you know there are different kinds of schools in Falmouth, depending on neighborhoods. MCAS is used as a diagnostic tool. So it's telling us where is the learning loss at different grade levels. So it will impact curriculum. For example, if they were out struggling with remote learning in March, and a particular unit was supposed to be taught and it didn't happen, that's going to show up on the MCAS, and that's what the analysis is about. We also know that children lose about 6 weeks of their learning. That's natural regression. So when children start in September, we always have refreshers, right? In September and maybe into a little bit of October. So MCAS is going to give us some data as well about that learning loss, and should we be repeating some curriculum from the previous year. So the where do you start is going to depend on the children that come into your classroom and their MCAS results. And so as a teacher, you're going to have to analyze that and know that, okay, these 20 children, in some districts they came from, 4 different schools, perhaps. And so where are they? And so individualized learning is going to be paramount in September.
I was also curious too about, at least in Massachusetts, how many towns offered summer programming free of charge to kind of get kids so that they wouldn't fall down. I know that was offered here and there. My grandsons took advantage of it, which I'm really happy about. But
it's the here or there.
Yeah.
Again, it wasn't necessarily something that was budgeted.
okay.
And summer programs have always been budgeted for special education. So you had to be on an IEP, but not only be on an IEP, you had to
show regression.
The IEP had to state that there would be substantial regression over those summer months. Now summer has become shorter, so natural regression is about 6 weeks. So if you have a child who on an IEP, it's demonstrated they need summer programming, you have to demonstrate that they're going to have more than 6 weeks regression. And so this year, some of the more affluent communities who had monies did offer summer programs to address some of these issues. Now there's the other problem. So we know that ed reform was supposed to even the playing field, and the taxes in town were supplemented by the foundation formula, and I won't get into it in too great detail. So if your taxes brought in funding at this level, And another community, the taxes brought funding to this level for schools. Ed Reform Foundation budget gave this much money to this town and this much money to this town to level the playing field. That was the premise of Ed Reform, to flatten the playing field so that it didn't depend on your zip code. It was a complete failure. So, the communities you're talking about who offered summer school may have been affluent, but they also may have been communities that got a lot of money in ESSER, and they used some of their ESSER money for that purpose. But there was such exorbitant costs associated with COVID that there wasn't a lot of money left. So, if there's anything else, I'm happy to answer it. Otherwise, I think I'm done.
Thank you.